Are you recording too? Is that what we decided? I can't remember.
Yeah, there we go. Both of us
Cool.
are. I totally forgot about that. Thanks for reminding.
Okay. I never know how to start. Adolyn, my wonderful friend, you are here to chat with me, chat with us, chat with Naked Faith about flipping tables. Before diving into everything, why don't you talk a little bit about who you are? Who are you and why are you
Who
here?
am I? Why am I here? Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for that introduction. No, this was a great introduction. So my name is Adolyn, and I've worked in the mental health and diversity field for about 10 years, sometimes in the front end and in the back end. I actually started off my career working as a youth worker, and that's where our paths coincided a lot because we got to run our own youth programs together for the United Church for probably the best years of the United Church's life.
Oh,
so
hands down, it's been downhill since then.
And then after that, I got a degree in cognitive science with a specialization in Buddhist psychology and mental health. And then I kind of just started working the diversity and inclusion field before they used to use that term, right? So building integration programs in the city of Calgary, working with the government of Alberta as like a youth ambassador, and then eventually traveling to Toronto, and going out east and working with various nonprofits. So currently I'm working for the CMHA, while working on some of my own projects in diversity inclusion. And this conversation is super exciting for me. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, I'm very grateful that you're here and you're willing to chat with me and with us. So we were using this term flipping tables, which I was describing to you before we started recording what it actually means. Essentially, it's just the metaphor we're using to talk about it's like a catch-all to talk about dismantling privilege, identifying norms that are actually oppressive, hurting vulnerable populations, and figuring out where do we need to, quote unquote, flip tables, challenge those norms, ask questions, make changes in order to make the world a better place, a more diverse and inclusive place. So that being kind of our catch-all term, the first thing I want to ask you is what does it mean to you to flip tables?
Great question. So I think for me, if we examine the metaphor a little bit, the first thing to kind of acknowledge is that when we say we have that table, that means that's the accepted norm, right? As you were saying, it's the status quo. And generally speaking, a certain number of people or certain types of people are invited to that table, right? And that's totally normalized for so many of us in so many areas of our lives. When we talk about flipping the table, whether it's this dismantling, this rough throwing of the table, or whether it's flipping the table, changing it around, whether it's making the table bigger, what we're really saying for me is that we're taking a look around, we're seeing who's at the table, and then we're asking ourselves, oh, who's missing, right? Or like, what's missing?
Yeah.
And hopefully we're doing that proactively, right? So we're leaving enough chairs empty, right? We're saying, hey, listen, we know we're here, but we're going to make sure these chairs are empty, so that people who feel like they're on the outside don't have to fight their way in, right? And so anytime we're flipping the table, we're basically saying, oh, we've closed this off, let's open this up, and let's make sure that nobody feels hurt, harmed, or has to really go through anything tough to get a seat at that table. You keep using that metaphor.
Yeah, nice. I love that answer. I like the expansion on the metaphor too, because I think it's so much when you talk about it as looking around and asking what's missing, who's missing, because it's so ingrained. I think it's hard for people, especially if you're somebody at the table, to even realize it. You don't even always know to ask that question. And so that being able to even ask that question, reflect on that and be like, hey, there are gaps here. That's a huge piece.
Totally. And then just to be really specific for our audience, in this case, when we talk about the table, for me, we're really talking about the systems and structures, right, that exist within society. And it could be anything from as little as like, am I making sure that everyone on my soccer team feels included, right, to as large scale as making sure the governments are hiring on parity with equity and equality. And then in this case, the churches as well, right?
Absolutely. Nice. How do you feel about being part of dismantling some of these systems? And because I know through some of your work doing this, how do you feel being a part of that flipping tables?
Yeah, I mean, so we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and I think we kind of got to a great point, which is, I'm here because of my expertise in diversity and inclusion, but I'm also obviously a visible minority, right? And whether that brings in a level of experiential expertise, I think that's useful in some ways with, I have the academic background, but also the experience of not being invited to all these tables, right? And we're talking about the Western culture very specifically here, right? Like if we were in different cultures, there'd be different tables, right? But let's talk about just like Canada very specifically. And so for me, it's been twofold. One, it hasn't really been a choice, right? And I didn't even know it wasn't a choice. For some of you listening, you might feel that way too. You probably didn't even realize you weren't invited to things until you started to miss out on those things, right? And sometimes it was really benign. Like growing up, you're like, I don't get presents on Christmas, right? Which, like, it's a cultural thing, but you start to feel left out. And then sometimes it's not so benign, right? Like being judged on your name or not getting that interview and not knowing exactly why, and trying to dismantle some of those things for yourself, right? You have your own self images as well. So for me, the first answer is, I don't know if I've always had a choice. And then the second answer is, it's been a privilege to dismantle privilege. So I've seen so much hope, love, so many people feel seen for the first time in their lives that I can't imagine doing anything else, whether it's professionally or personally. And I feel like our friendship has gotten closer when we've had those conversations too, right? And I think ultimately dialogue is so important when we talk about dismantling or flipping the tables.
Absolutely. Very well said, well articulated. You're so smart. I love talking to you. That's interesting. It makes me think, there's a bit of a tangent, but it makes me think of, I was listening to this podcast once where one of the people on it, she's Black, but her mom's Black and her dad's white. And she talked about how growing up, she never really thought about it. That was just kind of her norm. It was her family. She had a loving family. They talked about it like it wasn't this thing. But then she remembers very vividly the first time she saw, I think it was a commercial on TV where that type of couple was represented, where there was a white person, a Black person together in a couple. And she remembers crying, and she didn't even really understand why she was crying. Now looking back, she gets it, because it was the first time she saw herself, her life represented. And I think it's a good example of where you don't always know it until you see it. And you're like, that's been missing. That's a huge hole.
Totally. I'm having that same effect watching Dev Patel play Green Knight, because he's playing an Arthurian legend, and you would never see like a brown guy play an English knight, right? And now Kumail Nanjiani as a superhero, right? So no, totally. And it really makes me think of my own experiences at the church, being like a minority or person of color. Working for the church. So in some ways, it was amazing that I even got hired, if you think about the history of the church, right? And so, the United Church does such a good job of being so open-minded. And that being said, and I don't think it's anyone's fault, but just walking down the pews and knowing that I'm like one of the only persons of color, and we didn't have these conversations back then. This was almost a decade ago. And not knowing what was wrong, but something did kind of feel a bit off. Right. And I'm sure, and then maybe some people felt it too, right? Like, who knows? But I think that discomfort, and to, the metaphor of the story, when Jesus had to go talk to those merchants, that's an uncomfortable conversation. It's never going to feel easy. But that discomfort, restlessness and discontent are the first steps towards progress.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of what we're trying to embrace with this theme as sort of our intro to this for the year, is talking about, it's about being uncomfortable and embracing discomfort, and knowing that that's not a bad thing. That's actually means we're probably headed in the right direction.
Yeah, most likely. Most likely.
So that's a good segue into my next question. What tables do you think needs to be flipped within the church, given that you've had some experience?
Great segue. Well done. I'm going to segue your segue. Reverse Uno card. I think that, I don't know, that's a question I think for people in places of privilege to ask themselves first. Right. So I think and I don't think this is a mistake. I think it comes from a really good place. But one of the things that, let's say, the privileged culture right now, which is heteronormative, white, cultures want to look at minorities and ask them, like, what do we do? But I think you probably know what you need to do, right? You probably need to look around in your personal lives and go, am I actively making friends with minorities? Am I avoiding certain areas? Do I try ethnic foods, right? Like, how are you putting yourself in discomfort?
Yeah.
And then when we look at within the walls of the church, I think, and so let's be clear here, like we're talking about church as a whole. It might not apply to every sect of the church, your specific church. But we want to look at our history, right? We want to look at how we were an active part of incredible atrocities and tragedies throughout history in partnership with the government, and talk about that truth and reconciliation, right? We just had that day on September 30th. And so we want to look at that history. I don't know what the solution is, the large scale solution, the long-term solution. But I think the first step is taking a good hard look at that and seeing how maybe to this day we might be complicit in it. So how do we talk in the church about that stuff? Do we dedicate days towards it? On Sundays, are we, having this conversation in our youth groups? Is the pastor standing up in front of everyone and going, hey, let's talk about this hard stuff. Let's take a little break from reading a Bible passage and let's look at a passage in our own history. So I think that's the first step. And then we want to start looking at equity within the church as well, right? And I think we're moving towards that, right? But there was a time when women weren't allowed to be in leadership positions. And one of the things we've learned through the work in cognitive science is that generational trauma exists, right? Which means generational biases exist. So we might be doing a really good job of like opening resumes up and like inviting women and people of color to take positions of leadership. But you have to start questioning, hey, maybe I have an ingrained bias. Like when I see an ethnic name or I see a woman's name, do I automatically think, oh, this person's going to make a great leader? Or do I automatically go, well, let's try it, And we can't have that, well, let's try it mentality. So this is a much longer conversation, I'm sure. But I think the first step is just start to ask those questions. Yeah. Really ask yourselves those questions, those hard questions, and don't be afraid to muck it up.
Yeah, I think I like that last piece too, because I think it is a big part of what we're talking about in the theme in this service, as well as self-reflection, and that we have to at least start with that, of asking those really uncomfortable questions. Because I think you're right, we've gotten good about being more open-minded and learning, and that's all awesome. But I think we really struggle. It's because it's uncomfortable. We don't want to always acknowledge that, hey, like maybe I do have some kind of negative reaction when I read a certain name on a resume. Most people don't want to admit that, and yet it exists. We know these unconscious biases, unconscious or to some degree conscious biases exist.
Yeah, there's this great talk, and I can't remember the individual, but they get up there and they ask the group, they're like, how many of you would trade your lives with a Black person? And it makes people super uncomfortable because they go, well, I probably wouldn't, right? And why is that though? We're all aware of it. We're all aware of the systemic biases, the racism, the prejudice. And here's the thing: it's not going to be something you're going to change overnight. It's not going to be something you have to all spend 24 hours doing, but it is a dedication, right? It's like I'm going to be dedicated 24 hours to the awareness of it, so that when it comes up, I can go, oh, maybe I am a little biased here. And then that's how you're going to start to make those changes, because actively trying to look for it is it's unconscious. You can't consciously look for the unconscious.
Right.
So,
yeah. Well said. I like it. Just reading, what was my next question? Oh, what is a table you are currently sitting at that you think needs to be flipped?
So I'm in the mental health field right now, and the mental health field is still predominantly, at least in the organizations that I work with, are actually cisgendered white females, right? So it's, and you probably know this working in healthcare as well, right? And so, which is a very interesting thing, because there's has something called intersectionality, right? So privilege exists in different contexts, different circumstances, and based on your history, right? So for me, for example, I'm a brown man. So the brown part of me makes me underprivileged relative to the white culture, but being a man makes me overprivileged relative to, the female perspective, or the feminine perspective. So one of the tables I'm at right now is in the mental health world, and looking at some of the biases we're infusing from both perspectives, which is making sure that women have a voice, women are hired, women are put into leadership, women are trusted with money and funding and all those things, right? But on the flip side also of making sure there's room for the masculine voice in mental health, which is often, as you might know, as a man, suppressed, and men have to be stoic and can't be emotional, can't show feelings, we have to be strong, all of those things, right? Which is harmful. So the idea basically is, I guess the table I'm sitting at is the patriarch table. And what we're trying to flip is the patriarchy in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Taking some of the good aspects of it, right? The parts where that we've progressed as humanity, but really taking a hard look at the systemic inequalities or inequities within the patriarch that harm both female, male, and every other gender in and outside of that.
Nice. Well said. Yeah. I think, in the mental health field, there's so many tables that need to be flipped and are working on being flipped. I was on a committee recently that was looking at some of the TRC calls to action and how do they manifest within the mental health field, and what have we been doing, what haven't we been doing, and conversations around like a lot of our mental health interventions in therapy and assessment are very Western biased, right? They were developed in a Western culture with Western demographics. And it's been such an interesting conversation because it's this whole battle between, well, we need to be aware of that and we need to be culturally sensitive. And we also need to use evidence-based practices, but those two butt up against each other. And so it's just an interesting thing to be trying to navigate.
You must have heard, right? Like evidence-based practices or Western science is weird, right? So it's Western based. It's all the experiments or evidence is gathered from educated people. So WE, I can't remember all the other ones, but it's weird in the sense that basically what it's saying is it's Western bias, highly educated people. Often the studies are done on university age students, right? So there's ageism within that as well. And it's done to a demographic that has income and money. And that's actually a mental health table that I'm at right now, is looking at the socioeconomic factors and barriers that prevent people from accessing those resources that they need, right? So one of the programs I'm working on is trying to provide free access or low cost access to all kinds of individuals in different vulnerable sectors. And then so the questions we're thinking of is like, oh, what language should we put it in? Right? Why does it always have to be in English? Right? So
interesting. Yeah. We could do a whole deep dive on that.
I know.
All of these questions we could do an hour-long conversation.
A whole deep dive. Yeah, totally.
Tell me a little bit more about some of the tables you are working on flipping or have flipped recently. Like maybe it is more on the mental health or something else that you've been working on recently.
So one of the things I've been working on personally is creating some workshops around unconscious bias. And the huge table that I've been trying to flip is the internalized table that I have, right? My own status quo. And just by working on this workshop, a lot of things that I thought I had already worked through were still ingrained, right? And that's the thing. It's like an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing challenge. It's an ongoing awareness. Like I always say, you can't ever make yourself like unbiased 100%. So you always just have to, your rule of thumb should be like, how do I question myself whenever something happens, right? When I see a group of people and I cross the street, why am I actually doing it, right? And it might be legitimate. You might have those fears and that's okay. But you want to start to question them as poignantly as you can. So I think the table question, I guess similar to what we were already, similar to the question, making the workshop has been a huge endeavor. And then going into organizations and having those challenging conversations and not being afraid to stand up. I think that's a big one. Lots of times I've been quiet. Sometimes it's easier to advocate for someone else than it is for yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So for example, even in the workplace, right? Like negotiating salary, working on making sure that you feel valued, not having imposter syndrome on the personal set. That's all stuff that's so easy to do for someone else, right? But you can't do for yourself. And that's a table that I'm trying to flip. And then on a really practical level, I really care about like measurable outcomes. So I go into organizations, and my first step I ask them to do is do an audit, right? Do a cultural sensitivity audit, see how many people you have of various, whatever demographic you're looking at, right? Start there, do an anonymous survey, ask how people are feeling, right? Are they feeling happy where they work at? Do they feel like it's diverse enough? Do they feel like it's inclusive enough? Do they feel like they have enough knowledge, right, around these things, around these conversations? Make it anonymous, gather that feedback, and start implementing iterative changes and measure the outcomes, right? So one thing that I took recently was like an 8-week course on Indigenous history, right? And there's so many things I learned in that course, but my organization offered that course, which is a huge thing, right? So it's all good to wear an orange shirt, it's all good to have awareness, but that was a real practical thing that they paid for, that they offered to their employees. And that's the thing I've been advocating in the workplace. I'm like, nice. You need those practical changes, right? You can't just take a day off on September 30th and go, well, I did it. I got
like, good for me.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I think when we think about the church, it's kind of like that too, right? Start in your local church, start asking these questions, look around your youth group and be like, how come there's only white people here? Right? Or how come there's only people of this socioeconomic factor? How do we invite other people? How do we broaden our horizons?
Nice.
Stuff like that. Yeah.
I like it. Well said. Is there anything else that you want to say on the topic of flipping tables?
Flipping tables. Yeah, I will say this, that just really be mindful of the intersectionality. And it's not about blaming yourself. That's a big thing. So for those of you, especially during this time, you might feel threatened. You might be like, wait, I'm at this table. And if I invite someone else, that means there's less pie for me. But the idea is actually the opposite, is that as we invite more people, you get more people bringing in more pies, to keep using that metaphor, right? So my pie will have curry in it. So the idea is basically, if you feel like you're uncomfortable, obviously you're fighting what's called your fight or flight response. It's a change. And so both sides need to have that dialogue and this is just my perspective. So I'm not speaking for every minority out there, or every person in diversity and inclusion, but for me, I think the antidote to racism is conversation, right? And so but that also means I need to be amiable to you. For example, Andrew, you're, a straight white male, and a tall, good-looking white male, which has also got its own biases. No, but those are success factors, right?
Totally, yeah.
Research shows that if you're good-looking, you're much more likely to be successful. So, and arbitrary, like whatever we mean by good-looking, but like Western standards of that. But you're willing to have that conversation with me by coming in with humility, but I'm also creating a space for you without attacking you every time. And so I guess my last few words is just, I think people on privilege need the tolerance to allow people who have been underprivileged to feel things, to go through trauma, to go through grief. And through the grief cycle, there's denial, there's bargaining, but there's also anger, right? That's why the Black Lives Movement was filled with anger, and it needed to be there. And then we go through depression, and then we finally come through the other side through some sort of acceptance. But the way we get through that is curiosity, conversation, and humility.
Well said. I got nothing to add. That was beautifully put. I agree. I guess I do have something. I always have stuff to say. No, I appreciate the way you put it, that it's that reciprocal nature. It takes tolerance from people in privileged positions to know that it's not always going to be, and doesn't always have to be, a nice conversation.
Yeah.
And being able to have people in minorities in oppressed positions be able to open up space for conversation where appropriate, where they're able to.
When the capacity is there.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but the impetus and responsibility is not on the oppressed. So,
right.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, Adolyn, it's been lovely to have you here, and I appreciate your
Andrew.
perspective and your wisdom. And hopefully, since we're doing this all year, we'll get to have you back and talk to you more.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, stop recording.